Baffin Island is the 5th largest island in the world, and easily one of the most breathtaking. Like many islands, it's incredibly remote, sitting thousands of kilometers away from major roads or large towns. Located just north of mainland Canada, its eastern coastline is lined with massive cliffs that tower over 1,000 meters above the Arctic Ocean, which stays frozen solid for more than half the year. About halfway along this rugged east coast lies the iconic Arctic fjord, Sam Ford. Known for its awe-inspiring granite cliffs, which are one of the tallest in the world. It was here, in June 1995, that two American climbers, Paul Gagner and Rick Lovelace, set their sights on the south face of a 1,200-meter vertical monolith known as the Walker Citadel. On June 17th, after enduring 10 exhausting hours, traveling deep into the fjord, Paul and Rick finally arrived. What lay before them was everything they'd hoped for, a colossal wall of ice and rock, surrounded by surreal Arctic beauty. They felt a surge of excitement, but amidst this frozen wilderness, something caught their attention, and it wasn't good. The ice covering the ocean began to look wet. Small cracks started spidering through the 6-inch thick surface, which was a telltale sign that the frozen ocean was beginning to melt. Paul and Rick realized that if their climb took longer than expected, they might return to find the ocean completely melted, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. That evening, after reaching the campsite and settling in for the night, they planned to talk this over with their guide the next morning. He was a local Inuit man who was supposed to head back after dropping them off at the site. The next morning, though, they woke to the sounds of a snowmobile. Stepping out of their tents, they saw their guide speeding away in the distance, already on his way back. Paul and Rick couldn't ask him what to do if the ocean melts. The American climbers began their journey from the Inuit settlement, located about 100 kilometers from their campsite. They had packed enough food to last around 2 weeks. The plan was to spend that time climbing the wall, establishing a new route, and then heading back to base camp within that window. Afterward, they used the remaining days before their flight home to hike back to civilization. But there was one thing they hadn't properly factored in: the unforgiving unpredictability of the Arctic. What began as a 2-week climb spiraled into a nearly 2-month ordeal. With the ocean melting and no way to escape, Paul and Rick were stranded in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. As their supplies ran dry, the final 10 days were spent surviving on nothing but water, clinging to the hope that someone or something might rescue them before it was too late. This is their story. Paul and Rick were among the first few climbers to travel to Sam Ford Fjord. The area, now a popular climbing destination, was pretty much untouched by outsiders before 1995. Back then, even the best climbers couldn't fully account for the Arctic's unpredictable conditions. So whenever a climbing party did make it out there for an expedition, they'd stop by Clyde River, which was about 100 kilometers away, to get a heads up from the local Inuits about what they were walking into. Paul and Rick arrived at Clyde River via a flight. This was only their 3rd expedition as a team, but they had known each other for years. After landing, they connected with a local Inuit guide named Joshua. He helped them make some basic preparations and then loaded up his snowmobile to take them to their campsite opposite the wall they intended to climb, the massive Walker Citadel. Joshua's job was to drop them off and return in 2 weeks. While he was gone, Paul and Rick were supposed to tackle the wall alone, set their route, and then head back to camp. But instead of catching a ride like they did when they first arrived, Paul and Rick had decided to hike back to the Inuit settlement they'd flown in from. There was an old hiking trail across the frozen ocean that they could follow, making it an easy route to the settlement. It added a bit more work to the trip, but the adventure was exactly what they were looking for. The downside, though, was that their journey back was a 100-kilometer hike, and they were hauling around 90 kilograms of climbing gear they wouldn't need for the rest of the trek. So rather than drag it all on back, they planned to leave it at their camp, and Joshua would swing by later with his snowmobile to grab it. It all sounded simple enough, except it wasn't. There was a long list of things that could go wrong at any point. For starters, it was mid-June, and the Arctic summer had kicked in. This meant 24 hours of sunlight constantly shining on the snow. This is what's known as the midnight sun, or a polar day phenomenon. Basically, with the North Pole directly under the sun, even though the Earth's rotating, the sun never sets during the whole season. So instead of a regular 12-hour day, it becomes a 24-hour day that stretches on for several months. As they continued on their way, the group noticed the Arctic Ocean along their snowmobile route was starting to melt. It was only a matter of time before the ice fully melted into frigid, impassable waters. Normally, this wouldn't be a deal breaker since the settlement wasn't too far by vehicle and they could call for help. But because their resources were limited, they didn't have satellite phones. And by the time they even brought it up, Joshua had already left. To make matters worse, being so close to the North Pole messed with their compass, and GPS technology wasn't available back then. In other words, all it would take was one misstep for this grand Arctic adventure to spiral into a nightmare. Still, Paul and Rick kept their spirits high. At their camp, they spent a couple of days waiting and using binoculars to scope out the 1,200-meter Walker Citadel. The wall was about 1.5 kilometers hike from their campsite, and since the gear was too heavy to carry all at once, it took them nearly a week to haul everything to their first stop, about 300 meters up the wall. During that time, they kept making trips back and forth, carrying the load in smaller batches. But every time they crossed the ocean surface between their camp and the wall, the water on the ice seemed to rise a little more. The melting was happening faster than they expected. On top of that, since it was the ocean surface, the tides were constantly shifting the ice, and big cracks were starting to appear, speeding up the process even more. Paul even took a picture of a massive split in the ice caused by a high tide right next to the wall. After what felt like an endless haul, they finally got all their gear to the first camp and set up the ropes. From there, the real climb began. They'd scale the wall to their next stop, establish a pitch, and then make multiple trips up and down to carry the gear to the new spot. It was a rinse and repeat process, and by the end of the route, they needed to establish a total of 26 pitches. For now, the weather was holding up, but the cold was brutal. Even with the sun beating down 24/7, the freezing temperatures cut straight through them. While one of them led the way, manually drilling bolts into the ceramic wall, the other would belay behind, standing practically motionless in the bitter cold for hours until it was time to move forward. To keep from freezing, they'd move around in the cramped space, stomping and swinging their arms to generate a little body heat. By the time they reached the halfway point, they'd already been on the route for 10 days. And according to their original plan, they'd only have 4 days worth of proper food left. But then, conditions went from bad to worse. Heavy rainstorms and hurricane-force winds came howling off the ocean, making life on the wall even more brutal. Paul and Rick had to start taking more frequent breaks just to stay sane. Every other day was a storm day, and sometimes the bad weather would stretch out for 2 days in a row. When the winds were at their worst, they'd retreat to their titanium A5 portaledge, which was wrapped in a black rainfly for a little extra protection from the relentless wind and sunlight. But on those stormy days, they'd be stuck in that cramped space for 48 to 72 hours straight, with the ledge swinging and jolting like a malfunctioning elevator, despite the weight of 2 people inside. 20 days of this madness passed, and they were already far behind schedule. It had been over a week since they started half rationing their food, which left them hungry pretty much all the time. To make things worse, every time they got out to climb, they couldn't ignore what was happening below. The ice was melting away, more and more each day. They talked about how they'd managed the descent several times, but no solid plan ever came to mind. Eventually, they decided to keep pushing for the summit and worry about the trip back once they got there. Finally, on the 21st day, they'd reached the summit and finished the climb. The route they'd carve out was rated 5.10 plus, A3, meaning it was an incredibly tough ascent with unpredictable terrain and dangerous drops throughout. They named the route Super Unknown. Standing at the top, the duo spent almost an hour soaking in the surreal views of the Arctic Valley. From where they stood, the vast expanse of snow, covered untouched land, looked even more stunning than it had earlier. But as they took it all in, they realized the bay around the Walker Citadel had nearly transformed into open water. Without any real shoreline left, the wall now dropped directly into the frigid sea below, where powerful waves relentlessly crashed against its base. The climb was done, but the real challenge was just beginning. They had to figure out a way to make it back to safety. The first thing on their minds was finding solid ground where they could land once they got off the wall. If they could make it to the Mastodon Terrace, they'd have a chance to move sideways from there and eventually reach a frozen stretch of the ocean that was further away from where they'd started their climb. Mastodon Terrace was a prominent ledge sitting about 900 meters below the summit. It had been one of their stops on the way up. To save time, they decided to rappel straight down to it. After shedding some unnecessary gear, they packed the essentials into 2 hefty 40-kilogram bundles, each carrying one on their backs, and started their descent. Since the route down to the terrace was familiar, they managed to reach it in just one day. From there, the next task was traversing sideways to the shoreline. The entire following day was spent inching across ledge after ledge, and by the 23rd day of their climb, they finally made it back to base camp. Exhausted, and running on just a few bites of food each day, they had hauled their heavy packs down, rappelling one section at a time. By the time they reached camp, their energy was completely drained, but the ordeal wasn't over yet. All this time, they'd been banking on their guide Joshua to meet them at the base camp to help carry the gear as planned. But when they got there, Joshua was nowhere to be seen. Worse, there were no signs that he'd be showing up anytime soon. They realized waiting wasn't an option, so the duo decided to take matters into their own hands and try to save themselves. The hiking trail they planned to use on the way back had already melted, leaving them no choice but to come up with a new route. They pulled out their maps, but those weren't much help either. After some thinking, they figured out a bypass route to the west. This detour would lead them away from the frozen ocean bay, forcing them to trek hundreds of meters across an abandoned glacier, then over a river, and finally through a series of desolate valleys to reach the Clyde River where they had started. The problem was that it was a grueling 250-kilometer hike through completely uncharted territory, areas untouched by human hands. Not only was it more than double the original 100-kilometer trek, but it was also far more dangerous. And with their energy levels depleting by the second, even thinking about such a journey was overwhelming. Still, they didn't have a choice. For protection against polar bears, they had a pistol loaded with bear slugs, which they also planned to use for hunting along the way. But because of the slug size, it wasn't suitable for smaller animals. On top of that, they had no proper ropes, no reliable navigation, and no crampons to handle the glacier. It was the kind of decision that could easily turn into a suicide attempt. But staying at the camp wasn't any better. With nothing but hope, the pair left a note for Joshua explaining their situation in case he arrived, lightened their load by unloading some gear, and set out on their way. For 72 hours straight, Paul and Rick slogged through the unforgiving Arctic wilderness, with only the sound of their boots crunching on the snow breaking the creepy silence. The biting wind howled through their layers, and every breath was like inhaling a blast of frozen needles. The glacier stretched out endlessly like a frosted wasteland beneath a dull gray sky. Every now and then, they'd pause to adjust their gear with their faces frozen, hands stiff from the cold. Numb, both in body and mind, they had no choice but to keep pushing forward. The shotgun had been useless so far. There was nothing to hunt. Hunger started to bite hard, and their half rations were running low, with only a few days' worth left. By the third day of endless, fruitless travel, they realized it was all leading nowhere. No sign of life, no sense of direction. Just the same barren expanse stretched out in every direction. Eventually, Paul and Rick decided to stop and head back. They assumed that by the time they returned, their guide Joshua would have picked up their gear and the note they left with it. Since they had written down which direction they were heading, there was a chance he was already on his way to find them. They hoped they crossed paths on their way back, but as they trudged through the snow-covered glacier, all they saw was the haunting expanse of white stretching on forever. The sun never set, the light falling over the snowy landscape never changed, but the cold seemed to get worse with every step. time lost its meaning as the hours dragged on with no shift in the scene and no end in sight. 3 more days passed with their bodies breaking under the weight of heavy backpacks on a diet of a couple hundred calories. But they didn't see Joshua, nor did they find anything to eat. Eventually, the duo made it back to the campsite, only to find their gear untouched. Joshua still hadn't arrived, and the more disturbing realization was that after 6 fruitless days of trying to escape, they were back at square one. Worse still, they were completely exhausted, and the food supply was now alarmingly low. Paul and Rick tore through their gear, searching for anything they could salvage to eat. After going through every pocket and pouch, they could only scrap together 4 packs of ramen noodles and a few small snacks. While they were hungry enough to eat it all at once, they had to make it last. No one knew how long they'd be stuck there. The ocean bay had melted, leaving only a couple of large chunks of ice floating around. They figured Joshua would be there any moment to pick them up. With nothing else to do, they decided to search the area for food. Armed with a fish hook, they spent hours trying to catch something, but all they managed to get from the icy waters was a spiny fish with almost nothing edible on its bones. They tossed it back. Then Rick spotted a quail egg hidden in a tuft of grass. They picked it up and cooked it with their ramen. It felt like a feast. The remaining packets kept them going for 5 more days, and then they were officially out of food. They had started the trip on June 17th, and by early July, they were supposed to be back at the Clyde River settlement, but on July 9th, they were still finishing the last part of their wall. Now, it was August 1st, and they were stranded in the camp with no food, just a freshwater stream about 12 meters behind their tent, which was their only lifeline for the next couple of weeks. But as it turned out, it ended up being more of a trouble than a help. As the days passed without food, they started getting delirious and lightheaded. To make things worse, the stream's pitch would constantly change due to the wind, making it sound like a motorboat engine. Paul and Rick would get out of their tents again and again, thinking help had arrived, only to realize it was just their hallucinations playing tricks on them. Then one day, the weather turned bad, and the rain came down so hard that they had to relocate their entire camp, supplies and all, to a new spot. Desperation was starting to set in. The big question was, why hadn't anyone reached them yet? They'd missed their flights home, and Paul thought his parents must have called to check on him. Still, there was no one in sight who could come to their rescue. Day after day passed, and Paul and Rick's condition only worsened. They had completely lost the feeling of hunger, and with nothing in their systems, they couldn't even properly go to the bathroom. Most of the time they were asleep, drained of energy, and when they did wake, they could barely manage to exchange a few words. By then, they had accepted whatever fate had in store for them. Maybe this is how it would end. Slowly, breath by breath. Malnourished, weak, nauseated, hallucinating, and clinging to dreams of a miracle. All while stranded in the middle of nowhere. Another 10 days dragged on. What was meant to be a 2-week trip was now creeping up on 2 months. The past week and a half had been completely without food. They'd been getting by on almost nothing for over 15 days. It felt like death was just another week away, getting closer with every painful second. But then the miracle they had been praying for finally happened. On August 11th, 1995, they heard the sound of a boat in the distance. At first, they thought it might just be another cruel hallucination, but despite their doubts, they had to check. Unzipping the tent door, they were hit with a rush of hope. Down by the water, a boat was coming toward them, carrying 3 Inuit hunters. The sight was enough to send a surge of energy through their exhausted bodies. They jumped up, shouting for help. The hunters saw them, and within minutes they were there, pulling them to safety. The group had been in the fjord for nearly a week, and after a successful caribou hunt, they decided to check on the stranded climbers they had heard about before arriving. They thought they'd give it a shot and try to find them, just in case. And sure enough, they did. Paul and Rick packed all their gear onto the tiny boat, and the hunters offered them some caribou stew. Paul had been a vegetarian for the past 7 years, but he ate it like it was the best meal he'd ever had. Once they got back, they confronted Joshua about why he didn't come to pick up the gear. He said the mouth of the fjord was blocked with ice, and there was no way he could get there by boat. The funny thing was, the hunters had passed through the same route successfully around the same time he was supposed to come. It's still a mystery why he didn't try harder or check again to see if the route was clear later. Paul and Rick were the first climbers to establish the route super unknown on Walker Citadel, and were also the last ones to get stranded there in such a devastating way. Since then, the giant ice wall has become a popular climbing destination, with many expeditions coming and going. Every season, big wall climbers, base jumpers, couloir skiers, and other adventurers head there. Some succeed, some don't. A couple of jumpers have even lost their lives attempting it, but no one has ever come back alive after such an extreme and unimaginable ordeal. Paul says their success came down to their positive attitude throughout the whole situation. They never yelled at each other or let frustration take over. Instead, they focused on solving problems and waiting for fate to play its part. In the end, they walked away from a situation no one in their right mind would ever willingly walk into.